Hi, everybody. Jeff Urbin here from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Happy to be with you once again. Thanks for tuning in, so to speak. Hey, it's late summer here in the Hudson Valley, and that means we are now entering harvest season here in the Valley, when the gardeners who have worked so hard all summer long are finally getting to reap some of the benefits of the hard work that they put into their gardens all year long. And I want to give a shout out, first of all, to gardeners and farmers all across the country. Right here in the Hudson Valley, we're having a very, very dry spell. We're in a drought right now. And I know some parts of the country are experiencing drought. Some parts of the country are experiencing flooding. So it's been a very hard season for farmers. And I want to give a shout out to you guys and gals for all the hard work that you do. My grandmother grew up on a farm, and she said, if you're ever going to criticize a farmer, make sure you're not doing it at the supper table, because everything on that table came there from a farmer. So we thank you for that. I also want to give a shout out to our local farmers. We have a group of friends here with the National Park Service who have, over the last couple of years, reestablished the Roosevelt Home Garden, and I see them toiling out there in the hard work in the summer and the sun, getting that garden to grow. It's a beautiful, beautiful garden, and you should stop by sometime and take a look at it. It's a recreation, not a recreation, but a reestablishment of the actual garden that the Roosevelts had when they lived here on the property. Now, today we are talking about a certain kind of garden. We're talking about victory gardens. And I want to share with you the history of victory gardens, how they came about, the kinds of things that happened with those, and how they were so important to winning the war. Right? These victory gardens were feeding not only the guys over here behind me that were on the front lines, but also our allies and also civilians across the world during the war. Now, World War II began on September 1st, 1939. So we're coming up on the anniversary tomorrow. And that was when Poland was invaded by the Nazis. And World War II became the biggest, deadliest, most horrific conflict in human history. 60 million people would be killed by the time the war concluded on September 2nd, 1945. So the war went on for 2,194 days, and in that time, 60 million people perished. It was a world war. It involved and impacted nearly every country on the planet, and it was a global war. Right? The sun never set on World War II. Always somewhere on the planet, the war was going on, and it was fought on multiple continents and on multiple seas. It was also a total war. And when I say that, what I mean is that it involved not just the militaries of nations, but also the civilian populations, the young, the old, men, women, and children. Franklin Roosevelt said on December 9th, 1941, just 2 days after the attack at Pearl Harbor, which you can see in the newspaper here behind me, he said, "We are now in this war. We are all in it all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history." 4 months later, in April of 1942, in a fireside chat, he said, "There is one front and one battle where everyone in the United States, every man, woman, and child is in action. That front is right here at home in our daily lives and in our daily tasks." 16 million Americans served in World War II. About 416,000 died, and millions more fought the war right here in their own communities, some as close as their own backyards. Now, how did ordinary folks pitch into the war effort? Well, they did it in multiple ways. One way was with scrap drives. Metal, paper, rubber, kitchen waste. These were all things that were needed to help fight in the war. And citizens conducted volunteer collection campaigns, collecting up paper for pamphlets and maps, collecting up metal for tanks and planes, collecting up rubber for gaskets and flotation devices and life jackets and those sorts of things. And these were all undertaken by regular, ordinary civilians like you and I. It was sometimes done and organized through schools or churches or other civic organizations. There was also product rationing, things like gas, tires, motor oil, and even shoes were rationed because all the things that went into those were needed for the war effort. If you had some extra money laying around, right, and there wasn't a lot of it, but people did have some, you were expected to pitch in and help out by buying a war bond to help fund the Allied effort to win the war. All of these activities were going on here on the home front, and the home front was just as important as what was going on in the battlefield, right? These guys over here depended upon what we were doing back here at home. And one way that Americans really answered the call and really came to, to meet the challenge was right in their own backyards through victory gardens. Victory gardens were small vegetable gardens planted and tended wherever there might be a viable plot of land that could be found. It's estimated that about 20 million victory gardens were planted in the United States during World War II. Imagine that, 20 million victory gardens. Now, the idea of victory gardens actually goes back to the First World War. And in the First World War, these victory gardens were called war gardens. And Charles Lathrop Pock organized the National Garden Commission to, as he said, sow the seeds of victory. And the war gardens were organized through the U.S. Government. They were organized through school gardens, the School Garden Army, where students across the country would grow crops in their schoolyards. And this helped feed American doughboys and the American Allies, and it helped to win the First World War. Now, popular crops included things like beans and beets, cabbage and carrots, kale and kohlrabi, lettuce, peas, tomatoes, turnips, squash, Swiss chard, onions, and herbs. And these vegetables were packed with vitamins, minerals, and fiber that were needed to keep the troops healthy and able to stay on the move on the offensive. Now, these gardens had other benefits rather than just, supplying the guys with these vitamins and minerals and nutrients. These gardens also boosted morale. And they boosted morale by giving people who were not able to join the fight on the battle lines, right? Maybe a grandma or a grandpa, or maybe a baby brother or younger brother that wasn't old enough to enlist. Maybe a ma and a pa, a sister. It gave these folks the opportunity to contribute to the war effort in an important and meaningful way. So they helped to boost morale. Every day when you went out after school and you were weeding and hoeing in that garden, you were helping the war effort. It also provided an uplifting way of expressing your patriotism and your love and support of democracy. So it wasn't just, sticking one of those flags on your car or sticking a flag out in front of your house, or "We support the troops" signs. Those are all important, and they do show that you're supporting the effort of our armed services. But this was a nice way to really put your blood, your sweat, your tears right into the soil, producing those crops, producing those those products that could help support the fight for liberty and democracy across the world. The gardens also helped to boost the food supplies at home and on the front lines, right? As average citizens began to grow vegetables in their own yard and their own property, what this meant was that the food that was being grown by commercial gardeners was actually able to go to the packing houses, the canning houses, and then be processed and sent to the troops on the home front. So by growing these gardens yourselves, by growing these vegetables right there at home, you were not taking away from the supply that needed to be done for the canning and sending to the troops on the front. And the gardens also eased the burden of commercial farm workers, and also on the need for gas and oil and rubber to transport these things. So if you're going out to the backyard and you're picking a couple of ears of corn and you're picking a head of lettuce and you're picking a couple of tomatoes and a couple of cucumbers and you're walking them in the kitchen and you're cutting them up and you're making a nice salad and you're going to boil up that corn or maybe grill it, right? What you're doing is you're not using gas. you're not using oil, you're not using rubber. These are all important war materials. And because you're able to just walk out, get those and walk in, right, you've saved the trucking and the processing and all the rest of that would go into having those crops transported. So America's participation in the First World War was relatively short. It was bloody, to be sure, but it was relatively short. But the impact and the benefit of the war gardens was recognized as being very helpful, to the folks on the front and also for the morale for the folks back at home. Now, sadly, just a generation later, the world was once again at war. As described a few moments ago, it was an even bigger war, a larger scale war, a much more murderous, a much more dangerous, a much more destructive war than the First World War. Millions went off, and millions once again on the home front were asked to contribute to helping the guys and the gals on the front lines, and they did this again by turning to their own lawns. Now, soon there were labor shortages, transportation issues, and metal shortages, right? Because there was, you needed the metal to make the tanks and the planes and the ships and such. So there wasn't a lot of metal left for canning, foods and things. So this once again led to food shortages here and in the United States. And the need for these backyard gardens, these victory gardens, was once again realized. Now, this time they did call them victory gardens because they thought that, war garden, people are reading the newspaper, they're seeing about these sorts of things that are going on around here. They're reading about the turmoil and the trauma in the world, and it's depressing enough. So how about instead of focusing on it being a war garden, we focus on it being a victory garden, right? A garden that will help to bring about victory, a garden that will help to bring about peace, a garden that will help to bring about an end to the Second World War. So the need for these things was very, very prominent. Now, Claude Weiker, who was the Secretary of Agriculture at this time, was opposed to the victory gardens being in people's backyards. He believed that if people suddenly started, growing these victory gardens all over the place, it was going to create competition for very valuable things like seeds and very valuable things like fertilizer. He was also afraid it could lead to water shortages and also, supply problems, right? As people are buying hose and those sorts of things. So he was against the idea of victory gardens. He believed that the Department of Agriculture, working through the existing farm network, could encourage farmers to grow more crops, to take and put maybe an extra 10 or 15 rows in every time that they did these things, and that would be able to impact and increase the production necessary for folks here in this country, the folks on the front lines, and also our allies around the world. But this wasn't enough. And in fact, almost overnight, 20 million victory gardens sprung up in the United States, covering an estimated 7 million acres. People wanted to do this, right? People wanted to become involved in this. And everywhere across the country, yards, empty lots, rooftops, road medians, containers on fire escapes in cities were all growing vegetables that could be used right there where the folks were. Now, you see a beautiful, tender little sweet melon like this, and you wouldn't think that something like this is a weapon of war, right? But you would be wrong, because you could turn it into a weapon of war and turn it into a movement toward victory. Those guys on the front needed this stuff. Now, what happened was neighbors came together and they began to pool resources. They formed cooperatives. They coordinated crop growth. They swapped crops. They had swap crops where they would swap crops back and forth. They had seed swaps where, if one particular neighborhood had a lot of cucumber seeds and another one had tomato seeds, they would switch those and flip-flop those back and forth. So a lot of the organization was done really just by the folks right there, literally on the ground. Now, to extend the use of these victory garden crops, into the winter months, right? Because, it's harvest time now, right? So there's an abundance, which is great. But what do we do in February? Well, what we do is we get into the preserves. And in fact, canning became a huge thing in the 1940s. Now, it's interesting it's called canning because it should really be called jarring, right? But I don't know if you want to call it jarring. Hey, this is jarring. Oh, if it's jarring, I don't want to be a part of it. No, it's really canning, but we're canning in jars. Why? Because the metal for cans was needed for the war effort. So this canning actually took place in jars. And what ended up happening was in 1943 alone, 315,000 pressure cookers were sold in the United States, right? So that you could can your produce from the summertime and then put it in there and, blanch it, seal it up, and you would have these well into the winter. And in fact, Victory Gardens produced about 15 billion pounds, or roughly 40% of all the fresh produce produced in the United States by 1943. So these Victory Gardens were really creating a lot of abundance and a lot of necessary food. Now, during World War II, there was lots of corporate and also government sponsorship of these gardens. Even Secretary of Agriculture Weiker came around as well. When he saw that there was no stopping these folks from growing those gardens, when he saw the production that they were able to, to come about, and when he saw that it wasn't taking away resources, then he full-heartedly got behind the production of the Victory Gardens. Now, the government also took an interest in this. But before we do that, let's take a look at some examples of these gardens. So here is a picture. Let me see if I can focus in on it. So any place that could possibly grow crops was plowed up and grown. And this is Boston Commons in Boston, New York. My daughter is going to college in Boston, and we happened to walk across this earlier in the week. And I said to my daughter, oh, this used to be, farm land back during the war. And, she was quite surprised to hear that, and of course rolled her eyes, because it was one of those teachable moments that educators do to their kids. The gardens were also sponsored and done through things like the 4-H, through Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And here we see a farmer, a scientist, and he is showing these girls here, these young Girl Scouts, how to go about planting and how to go about tending and putting these things, these seeds in, and getting these things to actually grow. So young folks such as Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts could do this, but you also could have some of the older folks like Grandma and Grandpa taking a turn here in the garden as well. Now, I don't know, is it just me, or it's kind of interesting how the Grandpa's leaning on the pole watching, and Grandma's actually doing all the work. Okay, so that's usually the way it tends to work out, I'm afraid, in some cases. So these are, we're not talking about, amber waves of grain here, right? We're talking about small little gardens that are producing enough to supply the family with some food, thereby taking the burden away from the commercial farmers. So the way this worked was they promoted the growth of these gardens by companies would include seed packets. And so if you bought a product, if you bought a fan, if you bought an oven, if you bought a car, as a premium to do that, you would also maybe get some seeds that would go along with that as well. And the government provided these seeds, helped the companies do this, and they gave them a tax break in exchange for them promoting along the way with these seeds and such. Banks sometimes got involved as well. So here, and they put together these little kits. So here is a Victory Garden kit, and this was done by the Federal Savings, Federal Railroad and Savings and Loan Association, and they put together this little this booklet. So if you didn't know how to farm, right, if you didn't have a green thumb, that was no worry, because all you had to do was go downtown, get one of these books, and then they would put you right into business. And these were very detailed and very full of information. So on the inside here, you'd open this up, and they've got this little family down here. And let me see if I can go in closer on that. Let me do this. There we go. There we are. Okay. So they're showing you that it's an intergenerational thing with the whole family going out there and, going with the Victory Garden. So, the kids are all enthusiastic, and they're going out there and doing this as well. Then they'll tell you all sorts of information about, what kinds of crops to put in, how to tend the crops and take care of them from pests. They would show you, the kinds of pests that you're likely to encounter in the garden, and again, how to protect against those. And then they would go on to tell you a little bit about individual crops and the way to plant things. And some of these actually included, let me see if this one does. So here now they're talking about each individual type of crop that you might grow. So kohlrabi, tomatoes, potatoes, these sorts of things. And it tells what kinds of soil conditions they like. It tells the kinds of minerals and vitamins you're going to get from these. And it goes through with that. And then I think, here it is, back here. Then it'll give you an idea of the amount of quantity you can expect by based upon the number of crops that you put in, and how much of a yield you're expected to be able to get out of these, and how many inches between them they have to be grown, and the depth that they need to be grown in, the water conditions, soil conditions, those sorts of things. And then they would even provide you with a layout of what your garden should look like. So this is a graphic that shows, where these crops should be located, so that they're not shading each other, so that they're not fighting against each other for nutrients and space and those sorts of things. So you really couldn't lose. I mean, all you'd had to do was get a hold of one of these, get the seeds, and then with a little determination and some effort, you could get right in there and make that happen. And there were propaganda posters encouraging folks to do that. So here's, let me get rid of these. Put this over here. So here is another example of young folks, right? Join us on the farm front, right? Be a Victory Farm volunteer. And so there's, little Bobby and Susie, and they are, working their plot of land with their Victory Garden. This one shows how you can be young. Here's a little kid, right? Even younger than the two that we just saw in the other one. And, he's here looking at the great yield. Our food is fighting. Okay, a garden will help your rations go further. And again, encouraging mom and dad to be a part of this as well. Sometimes the message was a little bit more direct, right? Fill it, right? Help harvest war crops. So get out there and help to harvest some of these crops. Now, there was a group called the Women, I forget exactly the name, but they were women, young women who went and they worked on farms to help fill in the void when the men went off to the front. The women came in, and they were kind of like Rosie the Riveters of the field. And the name will come to me in just a minute, I'm sure. But it was the women's, basically like a crop army. So there were about 3 million of these young women who went out there, took to the field, helped to grow, helped to crop, to harvest the crops, and get them into the packing companies so that folks would have that on the home front, and also on the war front. This was to show you simply that, hey, food is a weapon. Don't waste it. Okay, buy wisely, cook carefully, and eat it all. And you can see here, these folks have eaten it right down to the bone. and they've finished their beverage. We always had a saying in our house growing up that you could take what you wanted as long as you wanted what you took. So if you put anything on your plate, you were expected to finish it. And if you didn't, you were in trouble. And then, of course, here is another propaganda poster that shows, here's a woman, she says, "Of course I can." Down a little bit. "Of course I can. I'm patriotic as can be." Okay, and the ration points won't worry me either. So here is a woman who has put up for her family the preserves for the winter, and so now she will be able to work through with her rationing as well. Now the rationing was really pretty involved. I don't want to say complex, but it was involved. And you would get these ration coupon books, and you were expected to use the point system to get what it was that you needed. And you would only get a certain amount, and you were only entitled to get a certain amount. And certainly, of course, there's always a black market. So there were some folks that were taking advantage of this. But most folks were using this system so that, again, we could manage the food supply so that the folks that needed it got it and were able to use it. And you might think, well, gee, that's great for the ordinary people, but what about fancy folks? Well, it even went for fancy folks. Here is the War Ration Book 4 of Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House, Washington, D.C. So even in the White House, they were using the coupons to get what it was that they needed in order to put food on the table for the folks there as well. They were joining in the war effort just like everyone else was. Now, the National Victory Garden Program was sort of created and operated through the War Food Administration, and that started around about 1941 and didn't really catch on until 42, 43. People were really getting involved with that. And even Mrs. Roosevelt planted a very small victory garden on the White House lawn. Now, again, they didn't want to do this. In fact, when Mrs. Roosevelt suggested the idea, President Roosevelt said, tell her that the only thing that'll grow is rocks, because they didn't want to, be bothered by having that on the White House property. The White House, by that point, the gardens had been considered to be, ceremonial and decorative, not for this kind of production. But a small little farm, little plot was put on there. And it was, sort of touted as Eleanor Roosevelt's Victory Garden, but it was actually tended by little Diana Hopkins, who was the daughter of one of President Roosevelt's advisors. So she took, the initiative and went out there, and she was only 9 years old, but she worked on this little plot, just a few feet by a few feet, and grew some crops there for herself. National magazines such as Life and Look and various so-called women's magazines featured articles and advice on growing gardens, on canning, what to grow, and how to prepare meals for particularly picky eaters, and also how to stretch food and how to make food go. Now, a lot of folks understood this from having lived through the Great Depression, right? They knew how to stretch this food, and so they were able to do that. And through this, there was a shift in American eating habits, and we began to go toward soybeans, peanut butter, eggs, and organ meats. In fact, soybeans were referred to during this period as wonder beans or miracle beans, because they were such a great source of protein when meat was rationed. Oh, I'm sorry, I just remembered. It was the Women's Land Army. WLA was the young women that went in and harvested the crops. Now, the homegrown food was really important because we have to remember what was going on in the world, right? You could grow the food here, and then the problem was getting it over to the troops, either in Europe or out in the Pacific. And of course, the waterways were very dangerous with submarines, especially in the North Atlantic. The German U-boats were doing everything they could to sink this food that was going across, to sink the supplies that were going across, and they were working to put those things down to the bottom of the ocean. Now, the front yard to kitchen, or the backyard to kitchen food, helped to free up space also on trains and trucks. Okay, so these things were able to be used now to move troops, material, machinery, weapons, those sorts of things. And that also helped to stretch, gas mileage and coal mileage and oil mileage in terms of transportation as well. Now, although he was a latecomer to the whole thing, Agriculture Secretary Weiker personally began to promote victory gardens, through pamphlets, through posters, through speeches, through magazine articles. So he got on board, and was able to encourage folks to do this as well. Now, people really took to this. And in 1944, April 1st, President Roosevelt made a statement about victory gardens. And he said, so this is for immediate release, press release, statement by the president, April 1st, 1944. And President Roosevelt said, "I hope every American who possibly can will grow a victory garden this year. We found out last year that even the small gardens helped. So even if you just had a pot, container gardening, on your fire escape in a city or something, and you grew a half a dozen tomatoes, that's a half a dozen tomatoes less that are going to be taken away from the guys on the front. The total harvest, this is the president speaking again, from victory gardens was tremendous. It made the difference between scarcity and abundance. The Department of Agriculture surveys showed that 42% of the fresh vegetables consumed in 1943 came from victory gardens. This should clearly emphasize the far-reaching importance of the Victory Garden program. Because of the greatly increased demands in 1944, we will need all the food we can grow. Food still remains a first essential to winning the war. Victory gardens are of direct benefit in helping relieve manpower, transportation, and living costs, as well as the food problem. Increased food requirements for our armed forces and our allies give every citizen an opportunity to do something toward backing the boys at the front." So this was not a burden. This was an opportunity. This was a way that you could help to serve the country. And people took to this. Here's a thing I want to read you. This is a letter from a little boy who is out in Chariton, Iowa. And this is little Bobby Gray writing into the president. "Dear Mr. President, in regards to your Victory Garden appeal," the one I just read to you, "I am 11 years old and in the 6th grade at Garfield School in Chariton, Iowa." And he wrote a poem for the president. And the poem goes like this. "My victory garden. Spade, rake, plant, hoe. Victory gardens are needed so. Food is needed to win this war, so let's all try to raise food galore. Just ask the owner about the old vacant lot and turn it into a garden plot. If you raise your own fruits and vegetables, this bad old war won't end so slow. We've all got a job to do these days in many, many different ways. So all raise a victory garden this year and keep many poor mothers from shedding a tear." Okay, so this was something that wasn't just a physical thing of getting out there and doing that. It was, spiritual and emotionally uplifting, for folks as well. So any place that could be turned into a victory garden was turned into a victory garden. If you didn't know how to do it, you simply had to go downtown and get, a pamphlet. Here's another pamphlet. This was put out by Victory Gardens in Greater New York. Okay, the Greater New York Victory Garden Council through the Civil Defense Volunteer Office. And again, this is, let's focus in on that a little bit. Very detailed. So it tells you, you open it up and it will tell you, why should I grow a victory garden? As if you didn't know already. And then it goes into the types of gardens that you can grow. How much time will this garden take? What about some garden plans? Well, here you are again, not as graphic as the other one. but it will lay out what you should grow, how far apart it should be, how many feet it's going to need this way, how many feet it's going to need that way. A good victory garden was generally about 10 feet by 20 feet, or a larger one would be 20 feet by 20 feet. And that was about as much as you could probably, garner the strength to take care of without, having things go to waste once you got going on. It'll tell you a little bit here about your garden tools as well. Okay, so these were the ideal sizes, 10 by 20 and 20 by 20. But again, if you had something small, go ahead and do it. Here is a chart on the yield that you can expect. A little small for you to read, I'm sure, but nonetheless, you put in this number and you put in this number of rows, and you can expect this amount out from the other end. What about the soil? How to prepare the soil, and then even some diagrams on how to go and put these things in. Now, this is interesting. I was looking at this and it was kind of funny to me. So, here's like a nice graphic, right? And it's showing you about, having a little ditch here for the runoff and such. And here they're showing you how to put the seeds in. And here they're showing you how to use the back of the rake, right, to push over the seeds gently so you don't push them down too far. And those are pretty nice graphics, don't you think? Well, the graphic guy must have been out sick one day, because when they got to these graphics, it's like somebody just hand drew them, right? So this shows you how you should go about hoeing your garden. Don't do it like, way over your head, chopping. Look at the sweat coming off of that guy's head right there. No, what you want to do is extend as little energy as possible by simply just, chopping a little bit, not way up there like you're chopping wood. But I love the stick figure configuration, especially when you put it next to, again, the professionally created graphics over here as well. But and by the way, this is probably what I would have looked like. I would have been doing that probably, as opposed to doing it the proper way. But I would have learned. I would have learned by looking at this chart here. So these victory gardens, very important to the winning of the war. The idea for them comes from the First World War. And 25 years later, they're back helping us win the Second World War. They not only provided food for the folks there on the front, but it also boosted morale back here at home by giving everyone a sense of contributing to the war effort. It provided an uplifting way to express your patriotism in a real way, in a real physical way of doing that. The gardens helped to boost the food supplies on the home front and on the folks at the front. And the commercial farmers were then able to give the money, the crops directly over, to the processing plants, who would then be able to process those into the food necessary, can it up, and send it out. And it also saved the burden of commercial farming and trucking and train transportation here in these United States. Now, what's very interesting about this is 20 million of these things sprung up across the country. 7 million acres in novice gardening, victory gardening. Unbelievable, right? This is the war effort at work. This is the contribution of ordinary citizens. And if you know anything about food, or you study about food, you will know that throughout the Great Depression, there was scarcity, right? You had to make, ends meet and stretch things as much as you could. Throughout the war, there was rationing, try to make ends meet, stretch things as much as you could. And this is what gave way to the 1950s and 1960s, where there was this backlash to, let's process everything, let's have instant food, just stick it in the oven, TV dinners, those sorts of things. Mom, who has been slaving away at the stove, trying to make this meal stretch for the last 20 years, first through the Great Depression and then through the war, she needs a break. Let's get some processed food in here. Let's get some Twinkies, some Cool Whip, some chicken nuggets, and all the rest of those things that so many of us grew up on. Why were they in our lives? In part as a backlash to the great work, the great effort that it took to feed this nation and the world throughout the Great Depression and the Second World War. So let's open it up to some questions and answers. I'll get my mouse set up over here. Okie dokie. Let's see. Let me go to the top here. Some old friends saying hello. Hey, everybody. Okay. Ooh, garden, Hyde Park Garden Habitat in the room. Well, welcome, you guys. Thanks for joining us. Let's see. Okay. Good talk. Thank you. Do I have a general sense of how much was for home consumption as a way to conserve resources and how much was for distribution to other citizens or soldiers? Yeah, basically, the whole idea of this was just to control your supply line. Okay, so right now you go to the store, you try to buy something. Oh, sorry, we don't have it because there's supply line issues, right? You know, going on with the Ukraine war or the gas prices or those sorts of things. So the shorter your supply lines, the better off you were. And so the idea of these victory gardens was you had a very short supply line, right? Go out to the backyard, pick those carrots, bring them in, and they're in the salad. So the idea was that you would grow these things as close to home as possible, bring them right into your kitchen and use them. If you had extra carrots, you might trade those for tomatoes from the neighbor across the street. Or if your neighborhood, had an abundance, they would have these little farm swaps, crop swaps. You would kind of like a farmer's garden or a farmer's market today. You could go and say, hey, look, my cucumbers went nuts, but my tomatoes didn't do anything. So here, we'll trade these things back and forth. So most of this stuff was used right where it was grown or very, very near to where it was grown. And that was important because it cut down on transportation costs, which comes, in the form of gasoline, oil, rubber, and space. Number one. And then number two was that the commercial farmers that were growing, the hundreds of acres of stuff, they were able to take all of that and it could go right to the factory to be canned and produced for the folks on the front. It didn't then have to be redistributed from there out to the grocery stores, and then you have to go down and buy it from there. So as local as possible is what it was all about for the victory gardens. And then the commercial farmers were able to, spread their stuff to the guys and gals on the front. Let's see, you just answered this in some of your last questions, but I'd still love to know the general split of home and garden distribution. I think I just answered that twice. Let's see, do the Roosevelts have a garden in Hyde Park? Yes, they do. And I mentioned that you might have come in late. At the beginning, our friends over at the National Park Service, who are our next door neighbors here on the property, I think I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, it might have been longer. I've lost track with the whole pandemic and everything. But they took it upon themselves to reestablish the Roosevelt home garden. And, it was really quite an undertaking. There had been a parking lot there. They had the parking lot removed. They've gone back to growing these things. It is, a work of love, a labor of love. And they've done a fantastic job. And it's been, great to see it kind of coming back season after season over the last couple of years where there had once been a parking lot. Was there an effort to specialize crops grown in the gardens by region? Yes and no. Basically, what they tried to do was your victory garden was designed to have as much variety as possible, right? So that you just didn't have 300 rows of carrots and then all the rabbits come to your house. So you would grow a certain number of carrots, a certain number of rows of carrots. You would grow a certain number of heads of rows of cabbage. Same thing with lettuce, corn, herbs, potatoes, those sorts of things. So the idea was that you were getting a variety of food, which would be yummy for you to eat, and also a variety of the minerals and vitamins that were in those foods so that you would automatically be having a healthy diet. So the gardens themselves were designed to be of a variety. Now, of course, some things will grow better in some places than in others. So what would happen would be these local pamphlets would be great, and they would have an idea of, okay, what you can grow in New York, Okay, so you might not be able to grow obviously citrus, right? In your garden in New York, but you could grow cabbage, right? And so it was kind of zoned that way, just like when you go to your local, flower nursery place, and you're buying stuff for your yard. They'll tell you if it likes shade or not shade. They'll tell you if it's in the right zone. If you're in the right zone to support certain types of plants and such. That's what they were doing with this as well. And because it was so localized and going on all across the country, if you went downtown and got one of these, you could be pretty confident that the stuff that was listed in here is going to be able to grow in your neighborhood or in your region where you are. Okay, anything else? Looks like that is about we're out of questions there. So you're probably thinking, wow, man, I wish I had seen this at the beginning of summer. I would have gone out there and done a garden myself. Well, it's too late for you this season, but you certainly could get involved with it again in the spring. Gardening is a wonderful exercise. It's great to be outdoors, and it's especially good to do with your children. Your children need to know that strawberries come from a plant that grows in the ground, not from a plastic container that sits in a bin in your local grocery store. And gardening is a great way to get in touch with the soil. It's a great way to get in touch with nature. It's a great way to get back in sync with natural time, right? That's the beautiful thing about a garden. You plant the seeds, you wait, they grow, you enjoy that. Then you harvest. Then comes winter and the garden goes to sleep. Not the farmer, but the garden, because the farmer is starting to plan for next year. Well, how are they going to rotate the fields? They have to fix the machinery or the materials that they have. Well, they tried to grow these type of pumpkins this year. It didn't go so good. So what's a better kind of pumpkin for my area? Those sorts of things. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on in a garden, or for gardening year round. And if you don't have a garden this year, go to a garden, find a garden, come to the one here on site and, enjoy the hard work of some of these other folks. And, you'll be amazed at just how wonderful gardening can be for your mental health, for your physical health, and for the health of democracy during World War II, because that's what helped us win the war. Thanks for tuning in. And let me give you another piece of advice. If you don't want to go to the garden, go to the farmers markets, because that's where all the produce is. And you can talk with those folks and get some great stuff that's grown here right in the valley. And be kind to these farmers. They've had a rough year with this weather, and they need your help. They need your support. And if we do that, we'll all make out better in the effort. So until next time, I'm going to go, take a look at my garden, and it doesn't look anything like these beautiful gardens here, mostly dried up. But nonetheless, I'm going to take what I can from that, and we'll see you all again next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.